I'm Rob Breakenridge for National Post, nationalpost.com, and NP Comment. This week, a closer look at what's happening in the Middle East, and the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran, and where this whole situation goes from here. Someone who is close to all of this and watching it very closely as it unfolds is journalist and National Post columnist Adam Zivo, who joins us from Tel Aviv. Adam, great to have you with us.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Let's just talk about the situation and the mood in Israel. Of course, Israelis went through this last year and the 12-day conflict with Iran. Of course, Israelis have been sort of in that mode with a few years of conflict in Gaza with Hamas. But what's the mood and what's the atmosphere right now?
The mood is very calm. No one really seems to be afraid. And that's because years of war have inoculated Israelis from experiencing any real panic. So this is something that I observed when I was in Tel Aviv during the 12-day war. We had a few missile strikes, and everyone said, look, previously they were receiving missiles from Hamas and Hezbollah, which were smaller and not as damaging. But this was just a continuation of all of that. And they knew that as long as they went to the shelters, they would be okay. Now, one thing I do want to stress is that there are shelters everywhere. Many apartments, if not most of them, have reinforced rooms. Most buildings have reinforced basements that have submarine-like doors. These shelters are borderline impregnable. And the system that gets you to the shelter is very well organized. You receive a pre-warning, so it's like an Amber Alert, and that lets you know that you should get near a shelter, but not necessarily go inside. And then usually if there is an attack, that you'll get a follow-up alert with an air raid siren about 5 to 10 minutes later. And at that point, you have 90 seconds to get inside the shelter. So it's really no big deal. You get the alert, you follow instructions, you get to the shelter, you go inside. It's borderline impregnable. You will be fine. Now, of course, if a missile hits your shelter directly, then there's nothing you can do. You're dead. But the statistical chance of that happening is very low. And people just here, they shrug and they say they may as well be hit by a car, right? So 12-day war, people saw that the IDF was able to handle the situation and effectively decapitate the Iranian regime, and that the strikes were much weaker than anticipated. And so now they're seeing the same thing is happening again this time around. Before I arrived, I was warned by many of my political and journalistic contacts that the war here could be brutal and could be a significant escalation compared to the 12-day war. When the alarms did sound, everyone just followed instructions. They were fine. The first day, we had maybe 12, 13, 14 air raid sirens over the course of the day. You lose track. You go into the shelter, out of the shelter, into the shelter, out of the shelter. But with every successive day, there have been fewer of those, and now life is relatively normal. It's great. And just as a final note, the reason why this has turned out the way that it has is because Iran rather stupidly decided to attack the Arab Gulf states because those areas are less protected. They're not built for war in the same way that Israel is. And so the idea is that by attacking those states, Iran can disrupt the global economy and pressure these states to beg the United States to stop the war. But the secondary effect of that is that Tel Aviv is really not being struck that much because most of the missiles are landing in places like Dubai and Doha.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, it seems like this situation now is much more of an existential threat to the Iranian regime, and maybe there's a little more desperation in their response. But it's been much more broad, as you say. Even word on Wednesday that they had attempted to fire a missile at Turkey, which of course is a NATO member. That's an additional possible potential complicating factor. But you're right. I mean, they've been going after the Gulf states, and I guess one of the consequences of that, Adam, is you're seeing all of these states basically uniting against Iran. It's a really interesting dimension to this.
Yes, and there's a historical context to this. So what we have to keep in mind is that many of these states are monarchies, and they fear radical fundamentalism, and they fear, the Shiite radicalism of Iran, because many of these countries are Sunnis, right? So there's some factionalism there, some sectarianism, much like Catholics and Protestants, but back when that actually mattered, right? And so they've all been hostile to Tehran. And so since the late 2010s, you've seen a rapprochement between these states and Israel, and that is epitomized by the Abraham Accords, which normalize relationships between Israel and many of the Arab neighbors. And that's, for example, part of the reason why we had October 7th, at least that's hypothesized, that Saudi Arabia was on the verge of normalizing its relationship with Israel. And then October 7th, with Iran's prodding, derailed that. So the problem with that dynamic previously is that it was mostly elite held, right? So the monarchies didn't want to have a revolution, but they were dealing with constituents who, for the most part, were very anti-Israeli. And I want to clarify that these are constituents, not voters, because these are not democracies, but constituents still matter, right? You still need to keep the population happy. And so that constrained what these countries could do. Now, I think there might be a radical change in the nature of Middle Eastern politics, because I would imagine that these constituents will be more open to rapprochement with Israel when they see Israel protecting their glistening, gleaming, beautiful skyscrapers from missiles being sent by Tehran.
I just wanted to ask you too about the politics in Israel right now, and I know there's been a lot of focus on Prime Minister Netanyahu, of course, corruption allegations, controversy over his attempts to sort of centralize power, all kinds of questions about the lead up to October 7th, and did he ignore the threat from Hamas and how he's prosecuted the war? How is all of that resonating in light of what's happening now and the broader threat that Iran poses?
Israelis, many of them, do not like Netanyahu. And this is especially true in Tel Aviv, which is the most progressive and left-leaning part of Israel. But at the same time, they understand that the conflict with Iran is different from other conflicts. I mean, they're all interrelated, but there's a different nature to it. So you have Israelis who will say, look, Netanyahu went too far with Gaza. He didn't agree to a peace deal early enough. He's corrupt. He's trying to centralize power. He's terrible. But in the context of fighting Iran, there seems to be a great amount of solidarity behind the current government. I think I saw a poll indicating that the vast majority, maybe about 80% of Israelis, support these strikes because Israelis understand that the Islamic regime wants to wipe Jews off the earth, wants to ethnically cleanse them from the Middle East. And they know that if they do not strike Iran now, then they will have their cities destroyed by barrages of ballistic missiles and potentially nukes in the future. So they say, look, we have no choice. This is the right thing to do.
In the United States, opinion may be a little more divided. I mean, the president is unpopular in his own way, too. But a lot of questions, I guess, as to what the U.S. objectives are here, what the strategy is moving forward. And at this point, I mean, it is true. It's hard to know what the end game is or where this all goes from here. But you had a piece this week in the National Post making the argument that this is a just war. What do you see as the objectives here? And why do you think it makes sense to act now against Iran?
Well, let's look at the justification from two dimensions. We have the moral dimension and we have the strategic dimension. And I think it's really clear from a moral standpoint that this is a just war. The Islamic regime has been bathed in blood from its inception. In the years following the 1979 Islamic Revolution, the regime killed thousands of dissidents, mostly left-leaning communists who supported the Islamists in the beginning, right? And then tortured and raped them and did horrible things. Iranians in the subsequent decades would occasionally try to call for revolution, call for democratization, call for the end of their oppression. And every single time they were slaughtered. And of course, just 2 months ago, they rose up, millions of them took to the streets, and approximately 30,000 Iranians were killed over the course of a few days. And this is unprecedented. This is equivalent to 10 Tiananmen Square massacres. And of course, the Iranian diaspora wept and then went to the streets and said, we need regime change right now. We need military intervention right now because this is an asymmetrical fight. The protesters are unarmed and they're against a brutal regime that has no scruples with using the maximum amount of violence to kill the opposition into silence, right? And so I think that anyone who says, well, from a moral standpoint, this is questionable, they're wrong. They're purposefully obtuse, I think. You'd have to listen to actual Iranians. Now, the strategic standpoint for the United States, I think also makes sense because look, Iran is not an imminent threat. I see that at least in the United States, I think that the United States is like misconstruing it this way or misrepresenting this way in order to put some, fig leaf when it comes to international law. But Iran is a threat to Western interests in the long term, right? It is part of this authoritarian bloc. It is allied with Russia, China, North Korea, and this bloc wants to topple the West and to subjugate it and to build a new world order, right? I mean, let's not forget that Iran provided many of the kamikaze drones that Russia used to bomb Ukraine. I have been bombed by Iranian drones in my city in Odessa, where my fiance lives, for countless times, right? So Iran is a threat, right? They refer to the United States as the big Satan and Israel as the little Satan. And once they're done dealing with Israel, they will move on to dealing with the United States. So we know that Iran is a hostile force. I think it makes sense, of course, to dislodge them right now because Iran is in the middle of an economic crisis. One of their major banks failed in the autumn, and the government's response was basically just to print a lot of money. And now we have hyperinflation. Who would have guessed? There's a water crisis. There's a political crisis. They, just murdered 30,000 refugees, 30,000 citizens, demonstrators. And so there's a complete lack of legitimacy. Whatever legitimacy they had previously has disappeared. And there is volcanic anger amongst Iranians, both within the country and in the diaspora. And that sets the stage for regime change. So now is the time to strike. When the regime is weak, why would we wait a year, 2 years, 3 years, 5 years? Why would we wait for the Islamic regime to reconstitute itself, reconstitute its power, and continue racing towards nuclear weapons and a massive ballistic missile arsenal?
Right. Well, that's part of the question now, I guess, is that the ultimate end game here from even an American perspective? We saw sort of the Venezuelan example where, the president was taken out, but basically the regime was left intact, albeit weakened. Is that a concern here that we might see something similar where you've got a weakened regime? Certainly their nuclear capabilities are severely weakened, if not obliterated, but that it survives in some form?
I think that's a distinct possibility. And Trump has indicated that he has candidates within the current regime that he could see as replacement. And he's expressed concerns about whether exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi, who most Iranians want to lead a transitional government, would actually have enough popular support within the country to lead a transition, right? Because Pahlavi is very popular in diaspora, and he has a big base support within Iran, but he's based in the United States. So is he going to be ousted by factions within Iran if someone tries to install him? That being said, if this does turn out to be an outcome, it is not the ideal outcome, but is certainly better than what we have right now, right? So even if we don't end up with a full democratic transition, even if we don't end up with Reza Pahlavi leading a transitional government that eventually leads Iran to, a prosperous future, a chastened Islamic regime, one that is stripped of its ballistic missiles and neutered in terms of its nuclear ambitions, is still better, right? We don't need to be perfect. We just need to improve this world somewhat. And I think that that's okay.
What do you think this means for Iran's proxies, right? I mean, Hezbollah in particular in Lebanon, and they certainly seem weakened through all of this. And Hamas has taken a huge blow in the, the war, the conflict with Israel. Where does it leave some of these other actors?
Well, it leaves them very weak. And one thing I just want to clarify to anyone watching this, before we go into the proxies in a bit more depth, is that some people will say, look, Israel's attack on Iran was unprovoked, and therefore it's illegal. But the fact is that Iran has been waging war against Israel using these proxies for a very long time. Iran has funded and coordinated Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and international law is not designed to deal with proxy warfare. You can legally retaliate against the proxies, but you can't attack the puppeteers. And so rogue states have realized this and have decided to exploit this to use international law to protect themselves. Now, with Iran being the major funder for Hamas and Hezbollah, one would imagine that these forces will be starved in the future. We see, for example, that Lebanon is now turning against Hezbollah in a way that it didn't do earlier. So that is a promising sign. And of course, it was very stupid for the Islamic regime to attack Qatar. So Qatar has been one of the region's main allies for Iran. It's a small state. There's only about 300,000 Qataris, but it's a very wealthy state because of their oil. And so Qatar has been pumping a lot of money into Hamas and Hezbollah, so they're kind of like an auxiliary supporter here, and has been spending a lot of money on global disinformation campaigns to build popular support for these proxies. So with Qatar, likely in the process of reevaluating its stance, I think that that will further weaken these proxies, and hopefully the proxy forces will recede and become a nuisance, not a threat.
One other element I wanted to touch on amidst all this conflict and the uncertainty of where this all goes, we've sort of seen this really interesting kinship or bond almost between Israelis and Iranians, this sort of Jewish Persian connection manifested through the protests. I think if people were watching, that was maybe becoming evident. But it's a really interesting element to this whole situation amid, Israel and Iran basically being at war right now, where you do still have this connection between the people.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this has been one of the loveliest things about the past year is learning that this fraternity actually exists. So back when I was in Israel during the 12-day war, I spoke with dozens of Israelis, and not one of them, not a single person said anything negative about about the Iranian people. They all hated the Islamic regime, but when you ask them about the Iranian people, they said, "Oh, they're beautiful, they're sophisticated, they're educated, they're wonderful. We can't wait for them to come visit. We can't wait to visit them." And I didn't fully understand that connection until this January when these protests broke out for a free Iran in Toronto, when I went to all of them more or less. And I said, "Hey, so tell me more about this relationship." And they all said, "Look, we have a shared ancient history." Mm-hmm. So back in the 50, it's like 550 BCE, there was this great Persian king, Cyrus the Great. And so he conquered the ancient Near East and then freed the Jews from their captivity in Babylon and allowed them to go back to Judea to build their second temple, right? So Jews see Cyrus the Great as being a liberator and a great figure. Persians see Cyrus the Great as an example of ancient Persian excellence. And so he is a bridge between the two. Now, the second thing is that about 2 to 3% of Israel's population is actually Persian, because there was a huge Persian Jewish population in Iran. And then when Israel was founded, many of them left, and then they went to Israel. But then, of course, after the Islamic regime, there was another wave. So the rest of them left, and most of them ended up in Israel. I actually met one of them in a bomb shelter recently. She ended up in Sweden as a refugee and then eventually made Aliyah to come to Israel. And so for Israelis, Persian culture is not anything foreign. They all know about saffron rice and all these other delicacies. They're very familiar with Persian life. They have, Persian friends, Persian wives and husbands, and they view Persian culture as being part of the larger mosaic of Israeli society, because, of course, many Israelis come from the Middle East, from various different regions, and they all bring their cultures with them to make the current state.
Well, we'll see where this all goes from here. Adam, stay safe. Much more, adamzivo.com, and of course at nationalpost.com. Thank you so much for making some time for us here, Adam.
Thanks for having me.
And my name is Rob Breakenridge. Thank you so much for joining us this week. Much more again at nationalpost.com. We'll talk to you next time. Take care.